I'm talking with Claude Convisser of Pop Diesel, a company that uses vegetable oil for fuel, and he's a vegetable oil fuel expert. And Mr. Convisser, can you tell us what is EPA's policy to limit greenhouse gas emissions from fuels used in automobiles?
Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't really have a policy to do that. Now, EPA issued regulations last year whose aim was to limit greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks, but particularly with regards to the regulations concerning diesel engines or trucks, those regulations will not accomplish their goal. The goal of the regulations under the Clean Air Act should be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions coming from trucks and automobiles.
How much?
As much as possible in order to prevent further accumulation of greenhouse gases. It's my business's interest in all this that the government shift its policy to doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is mandating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions directly. And if that policy is followed, it will lead to incentives for engine manufacturers, automakers to adopt the method of using 100% vegetable oil as fuel. Because the net carbon emissions from use of 100% vegetable oil are very low, very low net carbon contribution to the atmosphere as compared to using petroleum products, in which you're releasing fossilized carbon into the atmosphere. A concern that Pop Diesel has is that EPA is in charge of ASTM right now, this Petroleum Products Committee that has in the past restricted certain biofuels, and ExxonMobil in particular seems to be behaving in a predatory manner and getting the biodiesel industry, combining with them to try to limit the effectiveness of standards that they may approve to allow vegetable oil to go forward.
Triglycerides.
Triglycerides, right. That's the chemical name.
Okay.
So EPA is basically in a position to evaluate fuel quality standards that ASTM would approve and decide whether to rely on them or not. But if there's an EPA official who instead is actually the chairman of the board of ASTM, then I think there's a conflict of interest because that person is in a position of having to defend the organization rather than evaluate its work product objectively. My company asked EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson to cause her subordinate, Mary McKiel, to resign her officer's position on ASTM. She was then the vice chair of ASTM. And in response to that request, instead, ASTM immediately promoted Ms. McKiel to become the chair of its board. And my concern is that this is creating a conflict of interest, not dissimilar from the conflict of interest that occurred at the time of the Gulf oil spill, when you had a federal agency that was too close to the oil industry and was not effectively or properly evaluating oil permits, oil drilling permits, and that's directly what led to the BP oil spill, which caused huge environmental degradation in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I can't say that there's an immediate catastrophe that's going to occur because an EPA official, rather than being one step removed from ASTM, is now the chairman of its board, but I think the concern is that EPA will not recognize, if there's a situation that arises in the future, that the standards that ASTM is approving are biased in favor of the petroleum industry, and rather than allowing new fuel like 100% vegetable oil to blossom and become widespread on the market, the ASTM standards have the result of restricting and limiting them due to false and prejudicial information included in those standards. The concern is that if EPA does not have that arm's length relationship, the distance from ASTM, but is instead running the organization, that they are just going to do essentially whatever the petroleum industry wants in ASTM, and that's going to have a very negative effect on the kinds of products such as 100% vegetable oil that should be introduced to the marketplace and available to consumers and businesses and trucking fleets. I've kind of given a long answer, but in a nutshell, the point is that it's of grave concern to pop diesel and all those who want to allow for new alternative fuels to come onto the market. If there is a situation as exists right now where you have an EPA official who is actually the chairman of the board of ASTM, rather than having an arm's length distance relationship between ASTM and EPA, which would be a much better position for EPA to be in protecting the public good if it were able to then have that arm's length relationship so that it could properly evaluate ASTM's activities and standards objectively and impartially, rather than having to defend the organization as the chairman of its board.
So we've got a conflict of interest that may not have an immediate disastrous effect, but global warming and the effects of it are moving very rapidly now in affecting climate change in such a way that we can see there are these wildfires all over the West and hurricanes in Florida only very recently. People are going to begin to see this start to accelerate, and this fix on the use of vegetable oil is one small part of that, but it's an important part because it keeps us able to live on a habitable planet. It's one step toward that. So it isn't an immediate disaster, but in the long run, it could definitely be a very big one for us.
That's exactly right. The threats of global warming is insidious, and it's gradually increasing over time. It's not an immediate event, at least the buildup of the greenhouse gases. But we need to take immediate steps to get away from the use of fossil fuels. And if there's an organization such as ASTM that is vested with the power of approving standards that automatically become law in most states, and if that organization is essentially controlled by the petroleum industry, and in particular, if ExxonMobil wields overriding influence, as several high members within the organization have said, then the concern is that EPA, in having the chairmanship of ASTM, is in a position of doing the bidding of the petroleum industry rather than objectively evaluating the standards that are adopted by ASTM to figure out if in fact they're in the best interest of the public or not. And I fervently hope that ASTM will decide to give a greater place to triglyceride or vegetable oil fuels, and will allow advocates such as myself to occupy a leadership role in that activity, because we bring the expertise about the use of vegetable oil in engines and fuel oil burners. And if ASTM instead chooses to rely on folks from the petroleum industry or the biodiesel industry, they're not going to have the best interests at heart in seeing that those fuels are properly evaluated based on factual evidence, and that appropriate and effective standards are adopted to enable them to be used in the right circumstances in engines and fuel oil burners.